So we see a problem-solving device prominent in the world today known as war. However, we find this to be very contradictory because we think that when something attempts to solve problems by blowing things up, we think that when something tries to solve problems with carnage and destruction, this cannot be possibly conducive to a solution to problems, which is why we're proposing this motion today, that this House believes that war causes more problems than it solves. We're looking at a very principled debate here today, Madam Speaker. We're looking at a debate that's going to prove to you through multiple lines of analysis brought forward by the proposition team that war inherently does one main thing, that the problems that war creates for a country outweighs any potential benefits that it could have. But before we get into the constructive case, let's clarify the model here a little bit. What are we talking about? So like I said, principled debate, we're going to be proving this through a view of multiple ends and actors. But when we're talking about war, we're talking about conflict between two sovereign entities, whether that be sovereign states, like two nations going to war against each other, or like two groups within a state, so like a civil war or something like that. We'd say that just like overall, when this conflict escalates by means of violent altercation, that this is not the way for problems to get solved. We'd actually say that it's detrimental for the global community. So let's get into the constructive case here for side government. We have three main points that we're going to be bringing to you. I'm going to be talking about the harms of warfare, and I'm also going to talk about the effects on other nations. And my partner Tatiana is going to come forward and talk to you about the cycle of war and its destructive nature. So let's get into this first idea, shall we? This idea of the harms of warfare. What am I talking about? We see, like, quite literally, war is a method of solving conflict by means of altercation and, like, violence. So we'd say that, like, there are three main crazy detriments that we see come from war. First off, we're going to talk about human death. We don't want side opposition to write this off as something for the greater good. We really want them to understand that killing someone and taking away the most sacred thing that we have, which is life, is something inherently wrong. We'd say that, like, when you go into the difference between going into Iraq before the war and coming out of Iraq after the war is that 600,000 lives were short in Iraq after that moment in time. We'd say that, like, not all of those people necessarily are soldiers of the other side. We'd say that, like, innocent civilians, people who had nothing to do with this altercation, went down in flames. And we need to see a side opposition that comes forward to you and justifies why innocent lives can be robbed for the sake of trying to solve a problem, which we don't actually see get solved regardless. So we say that, like, human deaths, the millions that die in war, tragedy. Let's look at another major harm that we see from warfare, this idea of costs. So we'd say that, like, quite literally, one way that two nations or two entities will attack each other is by, like, destroying what the other side has. So we'd say that, like, in situations where innocent people need to use those services or need to use whatever infrastructure that the other side has, like, those people are profoundly harmed. Let's look at an example. Let's say, like, when Ethiopia invaded Somalia, this is already a place that had very little infrastructure as is. We say that when Ethiopia went in, they ripped everything to shreds, they burned buildings to the ground. We'd say that, like, people, again, very little to do with the actual altercation, innocent civilians were robbed of the infrastructure that they had there. And we'd say that those costs aren't necessarily just a short-term thing. We'd say that in the same way that the United States might have to repair after Hurricane Katrina, we'd say that, like, nations have to rebuild their place after, like, buildings get torn down. That's a major economic harm that we see in these nations. Like, these repairs have to go on for the society to continue going. We'd say that, like, that's a major burden that's put on that society. We need to see side opposition justify this as well. Go ahead.
Sir, they talked about how when Ethiopia invaded Somalia, yet in their definition they talked about how war goes both ways. Somalia, at the end of the day, had a right to defend its country. That's what we stand for. We stand for countries having the ability to defend themselves when no other option.
Sure. Like defense is one thing, but we say, like, first of all, like, when defense go, like, these defending nations also go in and start problems in the other nation as well. We don't say that they're completely innocent. But, like, let's look at the idea that, like, this is just a matter of the concept of war. The idea of war itself causes problems. Whether or not it's a defense issue or not, like, a problem has been generated, destruction happens, harms of warfare, generally bad thing. We talked about human death, and we talked about costs, like, quite financially. Let's talk about another example here, when we'd say, like, just one more example on this. When the conflict in Syria has had, like Lebanon is a country that's obviously not in Syria, but Lebanon has a lot of infrastructure that goes down when, like, this country is feuding alongside it. I'll talk a lot about it in the spillover point, but also innocent civilians of other areas are also getting tarnished. We see costs that they have to repair as well along their borders and stuff like that. I'll talk about it later though. So let's talk about this idea of the environment, another profound damage. We'd say that like when, like in Cuba, when the people were rebelling against the government, we'd say that like when the government was trying to eradicate people like who were fighting with guerrilla warfare against the government, what they were doing is when the rebels went into the forest, the government, in an attempt to kill those people, tried to burn down the forest, Madam Speaker. We'd say like that idea of just like tarnishing the environment because it becomes a battlefield is something that is inherently harmful for that society, creates a lot of problems. We'd say that like wildlife, innocent animals, innocent actors there also harmed. We'd say that like people, not like generations from now, are going to have the repercussions on environmental damage when you like damage the land in which a battlefield occurs. So let's look at like another example, a very extreme example, the example of Hiroshima. When a nuclear bomb is dropped in an area, non-discriminatory weapon, the battlefield goes awry, we saw infrastructure go down, we saw the environment get really punished in a manner where like nuclear radiation lasted for a long time after that, making it like hard for people in the area, innocent actors in the area to develop. So we'd say that like generally the harms of warfare, mainly on this idea of human death being tragic, this idea of the cost to the people involved being tragic. We also say like the environmental damage is also so profound. We see that this is very negative. We say that the problems are generated. So let's look at this other idea, the effect on other nations. Let's talk about two ideas here, one about spillover, another about strained relationships. This idea about fighting spilling over, I've kind of alluded to it. But we'd say like the idea when Syria goes to war, innocent people want to get out of there. We'd say that like, first off this idea about fighting spilling over. We'd say that like when conflict in Syria happens, like it's like, we do not confine war to the borders you see on a map in your atlas. It is something that spreads. So we say like people in Turkey are getting hurt, like people along the borders of Turkey and Syria are getting hurt when violence occurs, when Molotov cocktails go over, and like actors in other nations get harmed, like fighting does spill over. But we see like another profound problem. We'd say that like a refugee spillover is also very prominent. We'd say that like 200 refugees a day try to go from Turkey to Syria, from Syria to Turkey. That puts a strain on the innocent actors in Turkey who, mind you, have nothing to do with this war. Like this takes away jobs, this takes away space, and we say that like this can actually get pretty real. Let's say the war in Afghanistan, what happened is like Afghanistan refugees left and tried to get out of there, and they went into Iran. But what happened is in Iran, people started to really object to the fact that like they had so many Afghan refugees coming into the area. So what do? We see like a lot of violence happen to Afghanistani people. We say that like in 2007, numerous people were hung in the streets by the government because they didn't want the Afghanistani people there. Like people were forced to like get kicked out and go back to Afghanistan after this conflict happened. We say like 3,000 people are in queue to get hung right now in Iran because the Afghani people spilling over, refugee spillover is in fact a problem. We need to see them address that as well. Innocent actors outside of the war. Let's look at this last example of strained relationships. Let's look at proxy wars. We'd say like when Russia and the USA are fighting, it's not just Russia and the USA fighting. That can continue into other areas like we saw in Korea and Vietnam, where the North and South were fighting, propped up, and escalation occurred because the US and Russia were fighting each other. We say that like the conflict in North and South Korea was bad, but it got worse when the US tried and step that up against Russia. More people died than necessary. Like those proxy wars, innocent people happen because of two other actors. And we say that like also disagreements when you see like Russia and China siding against the United States and the United Kingdom on the Syria conflict. That's just general disagreement between other nations because of a Syrian conflict. That disagreement spills over into the international community. Spillover can happen in that way as well. So we say that like because other nations are harmed by war, not just the actors getting involved, and also because the people going to war cause damage, we say that like those two main reasons, war's causing more problems than it solves. We need an obvious consequence.
A world without war is not a world of peace. It is a world of unchecked aggression. Throughout this debate, Team Opposition will prove to you that war does not create more problems than it solves, but it does in fact create a necessary tool to have world stability and peace. Ladies and gentlemen, any denial to this claim is a hindrance to international protection and a refusal to accept the blatant truth. And it is for that reason that we will prove this argument up and down the bench. And we will prove this to you through the following 3 points. First, war allows to eliminate human rights abuses. Secondly, it allows countries to take necessary measures in self-defense. And finally, it allows for a stimulation of economy. Now, I will enter my first 2 points, and my second speaker will re-enter the first 2 points, and then continue on to validate our third point. Up and down the bench today, ladies and gentlemen, we will prove to you that stopping war does not end violence, but it in fact leaves country with no means to combat it. So before I enter my first points of substantive evidence, I would like to refute some of my opponent's points brought up in the first proposition case. So first they talked about the harms of warfare, and they brought up many different sub-points behind this fact of matter. They talked about human death. They said taking away life is inherently war and too many lives are lost. However, we need to stop human rights abuses, as my first point states, and as I will get into further. And to stop these human rights abuses, diplomatic measures simply do not work. Going into a country and trying to talk it out and work it over and sing kumbaya in a conference room simply does not work when we have genocide, when we have human rights abuses. And it is this reason that these countries need to have the tool of war to stop these large problems that, as I will bring up in further points of my case, cause even more lives lost than war potentially causes. Now, secondly, they brought up the case that the costs aren't short-term, and that the countries must continue to rebuild their society, and that war is extremely detrimental to the society as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at a statistic from Afghanistan. 564 deaths occurred each month before war was enacted in Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, 564 deaths each month before war was taken as a necessary tool to end violence, to end death, and to put this idea to rest. Without war, these violence would continue potentially to eternity, because there is no way diplomatic means simply did not work. War was the only option. Yes?
Okay, well, would you agree that when they went into Afghanistan, it didn't actually have the desired effect? For example, the war on terror has actually caused terrorist attacks to increase 4 times over.
The war on terror is a fact that we must have war, because diplomatic means within this is simply not a measure to end this problem. This is why war must continue, because we have seen that we have tried diplomatically time and time again to end this war on terror, and we have seen no results. And it is for this reason we must keep war in our back pocket, so to say, as a tool to use, because we see the great negative effects. Now, their third point in their case involved environment and refugees being hurt. So in the environment, they talked about nuclear bombs, they talked about burning forests. But innocent lives were being lost before these measures were taken in war, and Team Proposition poses that they just stand by. They pose that nothing be done because diplomatically it doesn't work, so they say, okay, 564 lives are being lost, there's nothing else we can do about it, we'll just let it continue because we don't want to hurt the environment, even though hurting the environment for short term will have a long-term effect on the total stability, diplomacy, and everything within this case. And finally, they talked about refugees being hurt. Well, aren't there problems with refugees in ethnic cleansing and problems and in genocide? We are solving the problem while they, ladies and gentlemen, are allowing the problem to continue. So with that being said, I will enter my points. Our first point being necessary to protect human rights. So here we stand by the statement that when human rights are violated in a nation, we need immediate reactions when diplomacy does not work. These are urgent crises within these nations, and we need to end the reign of despotic leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, it is under this claim that when diplomacy does not work, war is the only option. And stability is necessary out of this war. Now, by stability, we don't just mean being able to go run to the grocery store and pick up some food. We mean the ability and right to privacy and right to protection and safety within a country. And when diplomacy fails, war is the only way that we can, in fact, achieve that result. Yes?
You're talking about stability, but don't you think war actually creates a vacuum of power, allowing anybody who may have any radical idea to step in, as opposed to diplomacy, which is very controlled, very measured?
In no case, in no way, shape, or form is Team Opposition against diplomacy. But we stand by the statement that when diplomacy fails, there's no option other than war to correct these problems, such as genocide, such as human rights violation. And in these following examples, we will prove to you this statement. In the Holocaust, for example, 11 million deaths occurred because of the extent to which the Holocaust was carried out. With war intervention, we were able to stop this. We were able to stop the lives being lost by the genocide and by the Nazi cleansing. So we see examples such as this in which lives are being lost, and the only way that we can sometimes solve this problem is by fighting fire with fire to simply douse the problem and to put the situation to rest once and for all. So we also see examples where humanitarian crises cannot be stopped simply through diplomatic means. Now, I've stated this time and time again, and we see these examples arrive in Libya and the Rwandan genocide. In all of these terms, we are setting a long-term precedent for stability. We are promoting ideologies that emphasize the protection of human rights, and while the influence and to decrease the influence of oppressive regimes. When diplomacy doesn't work, we cannot stand by and continue to allow these injustices to happen, and that is what we are standing for. So we see that through this evidence, we are creating this precedent that is in fact extremely substantial in this case, as the only option to solve these international problems. And finally, our second point, it stops human rights violations. Human rights violations are an extremely prominent and pressing problem in the international scale and within our world. We see that this principle of self-defense is a fundamental right that must be granted to each and every country within our world. Each and every country, nation, or state has the right to defend itself if it is in fact infringed upon and if it is in fact engaged in war. We cannot say that a country does not have the right to allow people to come into their country and impose upon their rights, impose upon their lifestyle, and have no means of stopping it. War is necessary to allow this country this vital tool and this right to self-protection. Now we see that there are historical examples that war is a necessary mechanism to respond to these threats. We see in the Korean War between North Korea and South Korea. If we allowed North Korea to simply invade South Korea without the world backing behind this, South Korea would be in an extremely negative position. This is why war was necessary to help counteract North Korea that was invading South Korea, because they had this fundamental right to self-defense. And this self-defense every state deserves. Because when rights are infringed upon, when lives are going to be changed, when potentially more lives are being lost because of invasions by other countries, then the home country does have a right to react, to protect their very country. So because of this, because we are protecting human rights, because we are allowing for self-defense, and because, unlike Team Proposition, we are solving world problems that diplomacy cannot solve, we do stand by this case, and we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
We find it ironic that America's war on terror has done nothing to stop terror. It has actually, in fact, increased terrorist acts 4 times over since 2001. We think that is only one of hundreds of examples in which war has not achieved the desired effect, but it has just created conflict. It has perpetuated conflict, and furthermore, it actually gives birth to a new conflict. It creates something else that the initiating country now needs to deal with. And it's because of this that we believe on side proposition, war does indeed cause more problems than it solves. Because let's face it, war, as I will show you in our constructive case, does not solve anything. So before I get into my constructive point about the vicious cycle of war and why that's so harmful in our society and why it really does create a larger harm than any benefit, I'd like to go over a bit of rebuttal and reconstruction. Now let's first look at what they said in response to my partner, no thank you, Jacob's point. Now he basically told you about how it harms the environment, how it harms the infrastructure, how it harms the people, how these are deaths and tolls that the country is not equipped to take care of, that the country is not equipped to handle, and that the country will have to carry on their shoulders for several years after. Now, they dropped the first two. They dropped the idea about the environment. They dropped the idea of infrastructure. They did, however, respond to the idea of human deaths. And what they told you about human deaths, which they carried on into their constructive case, was the idea that for every second we're not in war, more people are dying. Okay, so what we're going to tell you is they brought up this idea of the Holocaust. They told us that by intervening, we actually stopped so many bad things from happening. We stopped so many people from dying. But what side proposition would like to tell you is they're actually misinterpreting how this really happened. What we would say is the reason the Holocaust happened is because Hitler got into power. We think the reason Hitler got into power was because of World War I. We think after World War I, when the Germans were forced into submission, they were abused by the French, no thank you, and the British. They were forced to pay reparations. They were poor, they were hungry, they were oppressed, and what happened was, ladies and gentlemen, they just weren't happy. And that allowed Hitler to step in. That allowed Hitler to abuse, no thank you, their need for reparations, to abuse their need for help, to abuse their need for, no thank you, a leader. What he did is he stepped in, and in their fear and in their upsetness at the rest of the world, they allowed these atrocities to be committed. We think that this is actually just one example of a horrible result coming in the period of chaos after one war. We think, no thank you, that when you have a war, when you remove, say, a dictator, when you're fighting for the rights, which they brought up in their constructive case as human rights and stability, we think that a war doesn't actually create much stability at all. We think, as Arslan brought up in a POI, that it creates a power vacuum. We think that when you take down a dictator, when you take down a government, I'll take you in a moment, who's creating human rights abuses and violations, what happens is either the Western world or the attacking country ends up implementing a system that the people don't want, or they end up not doing anything. For example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they just leave and leave the country to figure out for themselves, in which a new dictator will often step into power. Yes?
What we haven't heard from the opposition is when diplomacy fails, what actions are going to be taken?
Okay, that's an excellent question. We think that yes, there is a chance in some cases that diplomacy won't work. We recognize that. However, what we say is that either way, people are dying. We recognize that maybe war is inevitable. We're not saying that war is never going to happen. What we're saying is that it's going to leave the country in an infinitely worse state than it was when it started. So no thank you. If we look at the logic they presented to us today, they've told us, well, you've said people will die, we think people will die more if we don't do war quickly. Okay, if we recognize that, we still think people are dying, but we've actually proposed more tangible harms. We've proposed the harms of the infrastructure, the fact that the country can't actually get by, their economy, their political systems all falls down because of the conflict, and they actually can't represent themselves as a fully functioning country after the aftermath, no thank you, of war, no thank you. So we think that that's ultimately like a greater harm. Even if you cancel out this idea about deaths, which is a horrible realization, you still have so many harms in the post-war era. And what actually happens, no thank you, is an era of chaos that creates more death. We think in the struggle for power after a dictator is deposed, you have more deaths, you have more fighting, you have more conflict. And that's ultimately what we're telling you on side proposition, and that's why we feel that our case is standing so far today. So the last thing they told you is that, war is actually a defense. They told you this in their constructive case. They told you every country deserves the right to stand up for their stability and their human rights. What we would say is that they're assuming that every single country is defending themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, if everyone was defending themselves, no one would be starting wars. We have offenders in these situations, and we think that the offenders, no thank you, aren't necessarily doing it for rights. We think that the offenders might be doing it for land, they might be doing it for political gain, they might be doing it for reasons that 90% of the time, ladies and gentlemen, will not be because they want to liberate a country from human rights violations. We think that that is ultimately the greatest harm that we pose. We think that not everyone is acting in defense, and in those majority of cases, it's an offensive war, didn't need to happen, it's not actually helping anything. So no thank you, I'll be getting into my constructive case now. So what we think is that war is a vicious cycle. We think that no matter what happens, war is actually incapable of solving any problems, and we're going to be explaining this to you through two lenses. First of all, we're going to look at the fact that it's only ever a temporary solution, but after that, we're actually going to be looking at the unintended consequences of war that come as a byproduct of war and how it creates more conflict in the future. So first, let's look at this idea that we think when war reaches its end, it's not really a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that having a war to solve a problem is much like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It does very, very little to solve a deadly issue. We think that when you have a war, there always has to be a losing party. There always has to be someone who's either being oppressed or who is has conquered someone else and now the other party is being oppressed. We think someone's always on the losing end, and people don't like losing. In case you haven't figured that out, ladies and gentlemen, that's a fact of life. And what we see is that when a country loses, they're always ready in the shadows. They're always thinking, I'm going to start this conflict up another day. I'm going to start this conflict up in a few years. No, thank you. This is something I want to fight for because I deserve to win. We saw this the case with the two world wars here in Europe. We thought when Germany was forced into submission by the Treaty of Versailles, that put the German people, as I explained, in a very precarious position. Their society was actually not functioning properly. This allowed Hitler to take over and inspire their need for reparations, inspire their need for revenge, and that actually enabled him to put into place World War II. We think that that's the ultimate cause, this post-war era of confusion. So let's look at the second scenario, which is the unintended consequences. We think that in a lot of cases, someone will equip another force to do their dirty work for them. Someone will try and become allies with someone to solve a problem. We think that ultimately in those wars, the ally or the defensive force or whatever they're using to achieve their means ends up becoming an enemy. So we're going to improve three main examples for you. First of all, we're going to look at the fact that in the fight against communism, we think that in the Middle East, America trained the Mujahideen, which actually ended up evolving into the Al-Qaeda, ladies and gentlemen, which is one of the hugest threat that faces America today in their society. We think that that's one threat where they tried to solve one problem and ended up creating a whole slew of new problems for themselves. Secondly, we thought when they tried taking down the Nazis, they allied themselves with the communists. This enabled them to take over half of Europe, which ended up posing huge problems later on, resulting in the Cold War, which, though not, yes, a war, actually created an era of depression for a lot of the people in the society. So we think it's because of this. We think that because conflict never really ends. Someone always wants revenge, and war actually solves nothing, that we think this case ultimately falls to side proposition today. Thank you.
A world without war is one where we make no action when diplomacy fails and there is unchecked violence. What the opposition has called peace and time without chaos is nothing more than exactly the opposite of that, insanity and chaos, where there is no ability of the international community, no ability of the citizens within a nation who is being oppressed to defend themselves and stop the oppression. And we argue that the problems of unchecked violence are worse than anything that the opposition has claimed today, a proposition has claimed today in this debate. So first of all, before I talk about the opposition case, I'm going to address what the proposition has talked about. So their first argument is about the harms of warfare. They've talked about human death, the economic harms, the environmental harms, and the refugee problems. But to this, we say a few things. First of all, we say that all of these impacts that they have brought up are going to happen in the status quo when there is unchecked violence. So these are not unique to war. These are happening when there's intervention by one side and one side is unable to defend itself. But furthermore, we argue that allowing systemic violence and oppression to occur makes the international community passive to this genocide. And we argue that it is the duty and the right of the government to protect its people, and if they cannot do that, then it is the right of the citizens to stand up and provide protection for themselves. Wouldn't you agree?
Actually, I think it's the responsibility of the government to try and find other methods of problem solving, like sanctions, like political pressure.
I understand. And as we have said over and over again, when none of these methods are working, what do they turn to? They turn to inaction. We are arguing that anything is better than inaction because inaction allows systemic violence to happen. When systemic violence is going to happen and no one does anything about it, you are legitimizing systemic violence and allowing it to happen in the future because people aren't afraid because there are no consequences. This is the world that the proposition is giving to you today. Now, what we argue is that we will be saying that what they are essentially arguing is it's okay to have oppression because when you fight back, that makes it a war, and that is not okay. And we are arguing that you fight fire with fire if there is no other means to do so. Now, furthermore, we've talked a lot about the war in Afghanistan, and we argue that although there are still problems in the region, which would have happened anyway, we argue that the war succeeded in taking the Taliban out of power, which would have been much worse because they would have had unchecked oppression. Not only have we made a statement against the kind of violence that the Taliban has done, but also we have taken them out of power, and we are continuing to rebuild the region instead of allowing diplomacy to continue to fail and do nothing about it. Now, they have argued that the reason that Hitler got into power was because of World War I, but first of all, they are ignoring the fact that World War II stopped the conflict entirely, and we argue that oppressive leaders can come into power in a variety of ways. It doesn't matter that Hitler came in because of World War I, and when oppressive leaders come into power, they have still not told us what we are going to do when diplomacy fails. Now, the last two things they argue are, first of all, that this is only a temporary solution and there are unintended consequences. We argue that, first of all, we disagree that it is a temporary solution. We argue that it actually does solve the problems. While not every problem in a region that is unstable can be solved with war, we solve the problem that is the goal of the war, to take a bad leader out of power, whatever it is. And we argue that anything is better than this unchecked violence, which we've said up and down the bench. Now let's move on to the case that the opposition has brought you today. We have told you first that it is necessary to curb human rights abuses. Second of all, that it is key to have self-defense. And lastly, which I will bring up independently, that it stimulates the economy. And I'll take your point.
Madam, it seems like the only thing your side is talking about, in the one situation where diplomacy may not work, we can have war. Is there any other situation where war is slightly justified?
Yes, we believe that war is justified if it can produce good because there is violence and it can possibly stop that violence. We are arguing war happens because two sides are disagreeing. And we argue that if war can bring an end to that disagreement, which is causing tangible harms in the region, then war is justified. So moving on to our three arguments. First, that it is necessary to curb human rights abuses. And we have told you up and down the bench over and over again that when diplomacy fails, which it often does in situations where there are oppressive leaders, that there is no other solution than war to solve the problem, and war is effective in doing so. It is immediate relief for these urgent crises, and furthermore, we argue that it will prevent human rights violations in the future because we are making a statement as an international community that we are condemning human rights violations. And if we do not do that, it will simply set the stage for leaders to feel no pressure to follow by the international community. We have told you the examples of situations with the Mali-French Wars, where there were Islamics imposing Sharia law, and they were destroying Timbuktu. And in all of these examples that we have shown you up and down the bench, we have showed that at the end of the day, war has been successful in the goal it was intended to do: stop these abuses. Now, furthermore, we argue that it will set the long-term precedent for local stability. We argue that we are not only promoting ideologies, we are also creating the precedent that governments should and must protect their people. So, at the end of the day, we argue that while that war will not solve every problem, that there will still be some economic problems, there will be some other problems. That is not the intent of war, to solve every problem. It is to solve the problem that it is designed to do: take a leader out of power and then face all the other problems that we couldn't solve because that oppressive leader was in power. So, moving on to our second argument, that war is essential because it is a form of self-defense. We argue that essentially what the opposition is creating is a world in which intervention by one side is okay, but the second the other side fights back, it becomes a war and it is bad. So we argue that it is not only the duty of the government to protect the people in cases where there might be another sovereign nation attacking them, but it is the duty of the people and the international community to stop any sort of oppression that is long-term and happening structurally in a nation. And if they do not do that, then we are not serving justice to the innocent lives which are dying every day because of unchecked violence and abuses. And we have shown you historic examples, such as the Korean War. And we have shown you that, that in cases like the Korean War, we were successful and that war did achieve the goals that it was set out to do. And we did set the stage for stability in the long run. And that if we did not intervene in cases like South or North Korea, then we would not be able to express the ideologies that the South Koreans had. And we would not be able to create this long-term stability because North Korea might have just taken over the entire region and the people would be systemically and continually abused and oppressed. But moving on to our last argument, that it fosters societal development and promotes economic stimulation. We argue that in many cases, we were able to do this. For example, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, essentially, World War II got the United States out of this Great Depression because it stimulated wartime spending, unemployment went down, and the economy was able to boost itself up. And this was not short term because in the long term, after the war had finished, a lot of this sustainability continued and unemployment was, did not go back to pre-war numbers. We argue that similar things happened in France and Germany, and that we also promoted innovation in times where different types of technology and products were created, such as in the 1990s, GPSs were created. So in the end, we argue that because war is successful in stopping systemic violence, and because it creates economic stimulation, we urge you to oppose. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, we have one side opposition here today who's taken one example of diplomacy and thought that if they prove just that, they can win this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that's good enough. We think on the proposition, we've not only looked at diplomacy, but we've looked at every other aspect of this debate. We've gone through this debate through the full spectrum, and we think we've disproved it and won our side through the full spectrum. And we think on that basis, we're proud to continue to propose. Now, as the third speaker for proposition, what I'm essentially going to do is I'm going to divide this speech into three main points of clash and really clarify why we took this debate. So my three main points of clash are this. One, I'm going to talk about whether war actually is effective in solving problems. Two, does war stabilize countries and help them in the long run? And three, we're going to talk about some of the economic effects. So first, let's go into this first idea of whether war actually solves the problem. So we brought up a lot of ideas on this. We brought up this idea of how it destroys infrastructure. And what that means is it creates long-term problems for those countries. We told you, when a country like Somalia has its entire infrastructure destroyed, has its entire capacity to give its people water destroyed, how can we expect them to rebuild after the war is over? We think that's an inherent problem with war that they have not addressed. We think another example of this would be Eastern Germany. We think Eastern Germany after World War II was heavily ravaged, but because they were in a poor section, they were not able to develop. And still today, we see Eastern Germany being much poorer than the former Western Germany. And we think that's ultimately a huge thing they've ignored. We think developed countries can recover just fine from war. We think the United States was able to recover just fine from the attacks of Pearl Harbor. But we think countries that are poor, countries that need the most help, actually get hurt the most. That's something that was not addressed by side opposition. No thank you. No thank you. Then they talked about this idea how war saves a lot of lives, so that's inherently a good thing. Now, they only gave one example of this. They said in Afghanistan, 500 people died before. Now nobody dies, or like only 10 people die every day. Yeah, we think that example is pretty legitimate. We think in Afghanistan, they kicked the Taliban out. But we think ultimately on a global scale, it didn't do anything. We think when the United States goes into Afghanistan, all the Taliban has to do is move over one country into Pakistan. We think crime rates and murder rates in Pakistan by the Taliban has actually increased. We think all Americans did by that was move it. Beyond that, we think we brought up this amazing example of Iraq, where the US went in there for no reason, killed 500,000 people, and went out. We think they proved no analysis on that. They completely dropped that point. Then we talked about this idea of strained relationships. How with a strained relationship, what essentially happens is that could ultimately lead to more war. How it could increase tensions between countries and hurt world diplomacy as a whole. We heard no real response to that. So then they tried to bring up to our argumentation, no thank you. They brought up this idea of self-defense. They said, and this is one of their like very small, narrow examples of where it's okay. They said, in the situation where a country is attacked, they have the right to defend themselves. Now we think, yeah, we're not going to say if you're attacked, you don't have the right to defend yourself. But ultimately, we don't think why this is relevant in this case, because the reason they have to defend themselves in the first place is because of war. We think if war was unjustified overall, if war overall didn't exist, we'd ultimately never have to defend ourselves. We think that's a key concept that they did not understand. But beyond that, say that that wasn't even true. We think even through defending yourself, that causes long-term problems. We think if you're defending yourself and hypothetically say lose, all that would happen is that prolongs the war. What that does is it makes a 4-year war a 20-year war, because the oppressed continue to try to fight back. Key example of this, we can look at the Kurds in Turkey. The Turkish people took over the Kurds, oppressed them, and they continue to get trouble for it, and they continue to get hurt for it. That's something they haven't addressed. And beyond that, they said this last point in their second speech, which I found very interesting. The second speaker said that the point of war is to solve the problem at hand, the current short-term problem. And we completely agree with that. The point of war is to solve the direct problem. But the fundamental issue is, war completely ignores the long-term problems. War completely ignores the fact that through solving the short-term problem, you're actually creating more problems for yourself in the long term. That's a fundamental idea that's come up all the time on proposition and never answered, sure.
There will be no ability to have long-term stability if we don't solve the short-term barriers to that. Maybe a bad leader in power.
We think they're saying that the barrier is essentially a leader in power and the only way to take them out is through war. But essentially, we think diplomacy and other ways are far better than that for a very simple reason. We think when you have war, there's actually a very large state of chaos. Meaning all you do is you don't solve the problem. You take out the barrier and put 6 more walls in front of you. Ultimately, we don't think they stand. So let's move on to the second point. Does war help stabilize countries? Now, this really came up on their side first. They said war helps solve humanitarian conflicts. Again, we don't think this is very true at all. We think any humanitarian first of all, we think any humanitarian conflicts they've solved, it's actually caused. Example of this would be the Holocaust. We think the effects of World War I caused Hitler to come into power and affect the Holocaust, so anything it solved, it actually created. But beyond that, we think it actually creates more problems. We think they went into Iraq and took out Saddam Hussein, and that's good. He was a bad person, he was killing people, that's a general humanitarian benefit. But we think what happened is insurgents came up in his place and are hurting people even worse now. We think that's a fundamental idea they've missed. No thank you. Then we brought up this idea of this general idea of diplomacy and how that's better. So the idea that we heard was that diplomacy doesn't work. And we think that's fundamentally false. Because if you're talking about self-defense, if you're talking about this idea of wanting to get the war over with, because if you're defending yourself, you'd rather get it over with as soon as possible, in those situations, we think they like diplomacy. We think they'd like to have a situation that hurts the least people. And ultimately, we think what diplomacy is, it's very slow. It's much slower than war is. But we'd rather have a process that's slow but gets the job done right so we prevent further conflict than have a very quick, very hasty decision that ultimately hurts us in the long run. We didn't take any response to this. We talked about unintended consequences, the fact We talked about examples like the Taliban, how the United States' involvement and the war with the Soviets led to the creation of the Taliban through the Mujahideen, and the example they tried to bring up was Korea. We think ultimately American-Russian involvement in Korea actually exacerbated that war, made it even worse, and ultimately we don't think their point stands. They talked about how they took the Taliban in power. We think that's false. We think the Taliban control 40% of Afghanistan. We think they're having a very American view on this. So then they went into their third point, which is about the economic effects. So what the second speaker said was that there's economic stimulus. That's inherently a good thing. Now, something we don't understand is why do we need war to have economic stimulus? Why can't we directly invest into education, into infrastructure, into building? Why do we need war to be the access to investment? Why do we need war to be the way to basic stimulus? We think ultimately, in the United States, yeah, war was the way to stimulus, but we think providing one example isn't enough. We think if we want stimulus, why do we need to kill people along the way? Why not just have very simple stimulus? They didn't really understand that. So essentially what the proposition has brought you today is we're not saying you shouldn't defend yourself. We're saying war is bad. We're saying people killing each other is a bad thing. And ultimately, what we're saying is that we want the solution, we want the conflict resolution mechanism that ultimately ends the conflict. Doesn't put a band-aid on it, but actually stitches it up. So we think for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Speaker, this resolution must and will stand.
Ending war does not solve the problem of violence. It only leaves countries with no means to combat it. That has been the stance of side opposition up and down the bench today. And in my speech, I will prove to you two things. First, I will be discussing the fact that does war solve problems and prove to you that in most cases it does, and secondly, that diplomacy and inaction do not work in the international community. Secondly, I'll be talking to you about the individual situations in which war is necessary. It's the only solution to intervention, and it's the only solution that actually achieves results. First, the effects of war and if it solves problems. Now, side proposition has talked to you a lot about the harms of warfare. They spent a lot of their first speech talking about how it damages environment, it damages infrastructure, it leads to economic instability. But we question the fact that what if countries had not intervened? We think that if countries had not intervened, they had not taken military action against the problems that were facing them in the first place, then that would have left these countries with unchecked violence. That is something that side opposition will not stand for. Any effects that they can claim in terms of these areas, infrastructure, economics, and all these other things, are outweighed significantly by unchecked violence that the international community essentially condones by taking inaction, by not taking a definitive military stance against these abuses. Secondly, we think that it's a false assumption that ending war ends negative intent. It means that there is no way to check violence. They somehow think that ending war and taking it away as a diplomatic measure, that saying that war is not justified in any case, that does not take negative intent out of the world. That means that when there is a conflict, that war cannot be used to solve it. We think that saying that war is not justified in terms of solving a problem, that will somehow end all disagreement within the national community is a flawed proposition. We don't think that's true in any case whatsoever, and we think that if you recognize that, if you recognize that saying that war is bad does not end negative intent, and that taking war away leaves countries without any options to stop these abuses, to stop these negative things from occurring in countries worldwide, then we win this debate. They talked a lot about how the United States war on terror caused more problems than it solved. It caused power vacuums and all of those things. But we think that if the regime and the Taliban in Afghanistan and Iraq had actually continued without any sort of international intervention, then the Taliban would have risen to power and would have been in control of the government from day one. Now, what are the negative effects of that?
We think that if the Taliban had risen to power, then that 564 death per month statistic that was brought up in our second speech would have only raised higher and higher. We think that by the international community taking a definitive stance, it's unified the community in its opposition to world terror. And we think that that is the only way that we can definitively solve these problems. These power vacuums around the world are combated by the global stance against terrorism. We think that this is overwhelmingly more significant than the what side proposition proposes. But furthermore, they bring us the example of World War II. They talk about how it was ultimately caused by the negative effects of World War I. But we think that, firstly, that's only an example that shows how bad diplomacy can ultimately solve more problems. Negotiations between Austria and the winning side of World War I and World War II, that agreement actually ended up causing the negative effects that led Germany to declare war. But at the end of the day, they failed to recognize that World War II solved the problems inherent after World War I. We think that World War II succeeded in creating an international unified European community. Europe is now unified politically, Europe is now unified economically, and there is no power vacuum. There weren't any significant negative effects that they brought up in that case in Europe. Yes?
Sir, World War II led to the Cold War and a series of the worst conflicts of the 20th century. How is that necessarily solving the conflicts?
It did solve the conflict. If you take a look at Europe before World War II and Europe after World War II, what do we see? We see that before World War II, there was a divided European community that was separated by fascism versus democracy. We think that that totalitarianism versus democracy in Europe ultimately led to a conflict. But what happened? The conflict was resolved, and today, because of that war, because of the Cold War, we now have a European unified community that's unified both politically and economically. It's solved more problems. Next, they talk about the cycle of violence and instability, how we are creating more death because of war. But we reject this notion. We think that war is repeatedly used to solve violence, and war checks authoritarian regimes that's stopping its original intent of violence in the first place. And secondly, they write off our notion of self-defense as not being relevant to this debate, but that's wrong. We think that in cases where countries are abusing ethnic minorities, and I'll give you another example of why this is the case. In the case of the Bangladesh Liberation War, East Pakistan, and the country of India united in order to oppose the Pakistan government that was significantly persecuting the Bangladesh minorities. And we think that the ability of the Pakistani people to stand up to their government, to ally with the Indian government and create a sovereign nation is another way that shows that war actually solves problems. It gives benefits to these sovereign nations, allows them to grow, and allows them to be express the views of the minorities in these countries. Even if we disagree with the fact that they write off our notion of self-defense, even if we only talk offensive wars, we think that's still wrong in the case of these sovereign nations and checking these human rights abuses. So, now let's move on to why war is necessary. Side opposition has talked to you over and over again about why the notion of self-defense is incredibly important. We think that at the end of the day, governments have an intrinsic duty to serve to their citizens, and that basic duty is protection. We think that if governments cannot provide protection to their people, then the government is essentially irrelevant. Now, what happens in these places where the government cannot provide safety and cannot provide stability in the face of an authoritarian dictator that does not allow his people basic rights? We think that there must be a definitive military stance. We think that in these situations, diplomacy does not work. And we think that it is absurd that side proposition can come up and advocate the benefits of diplomacy, advocate international effects of other means of diplomacy and conflict resolution when they cannot even give one example of diplomacy working. We think that we have provided you with multiple examples 5 times over. We talked about World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Bangladesh Liberation War, and the Korean War, and shown you how problems in these countries have ultimately been solved. But more than that, when we discuss human rights abuses and foreign intervention, we think that this allows for the promotion of positive ideologies, pro-human rights, against and checking the power of these authoritarian regimes. War solves these problems. So at the end of the day, we ask proposition, what if nothing had been done? What if war was not justified in terms of conflict resolution? We would think that that would create a far worse outcome than anything that they can propose. Furthermore, we think that they're not engaging our point of self-defense, that they're not adequately giving a response to this point. Finally, we think that war is justified Why is that? It ultimately solves problems at the end of the day, and it is the only term of conflict resolution that can actually bring about those significant results. Its ability to check the power of authoritarian regimes, its ability to give rights to the people, and its ability to create sovereign nations and the effect of these long-term problems shows why war creates long-term sustainability. That is what side opposition stands for. Thank you.
Albert Einstein once said, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." And insanity is exactly what we see when we look at side proposition's case. We argue that arguing for slow and steady diplomacy is essentially arguing for inaction. This is essentially arguing for what we've been doing, in essence, many times before. And when we finally realized in all those cases that we are tired of appeasement and that we must take action, that is when change happened. In every single situation, they have not shown us a single situation in which we have dealt with an oppressive leader who does not want to change their policies, and they did because of diplomacy. So we challenge them to come up with an example of that. But furthermore, I will look at this debate in terms of two different perspectives, pragmatics and then principle. So let's talk about the pragmatics that have come up in this debate. And a lot of that does have to do with diplomacy. We have told you up and down the bench that diplomacy does not work. As ladies and gentlemen, we have seen the effects of appeasement. And we put an end to appeasement when we realize that no change happens when there is a leader that actively does not care about their citizens or actively does not care about engaging in diplomatic efforts. When a country is saying we do not want to work with other nations, we do not want to work in the United Nations, when they are actively avoiding and being isolationist, then there is no diplomacy. Now, as I have said before, slow and steady is an excuse for we don't know if it'll ever happen, but we'll just stick around and hope for maybe. And we argue that maybe is not enough when there's unchecked oppression. And furthermore, we've talked to you about the benefits to the economy of nations, and we reject their statement that we are using war as an excuse to make the economy better. We are simply arguing that there are pragmatic benefits to war in the cases in which it happens. We are not arguing that we should, instead of investing in education in our society, that we should just engage in war. We are just showing the positives that come out of war occasionally. But moving on to the argument about principle. Now, we have shown you up and down the bench a very clear stance on what we believe the right of the sovereign nation is, the duty of the government to protect their people, and what the long-term implications of war is. And I will talk to you about that first. So let's talk about the precedent that is set when we allow for unchecked violence to go without international intervention. We argue that allowing the international community to wait by while genocide happens is much worse than actually taking action. We have seen the international community condemn major countries like the United States when they do not take action in nations in which we see genocide, in which we see unchecked oppression. And we argue that taking action, even if it does not solve every problem of the environment, of the economy, is best because it sets the stage to be able to have diplomacy, to be able to have sovereign nations express their beliefs and put leaders that they would like in power and make the economy better, make their environment better. We say that the first thing you have to do is actually have war, because without war, there will not be change. We reject the idea that diplomacy will create change in these situations. But furthermore, we have told you that the government's duty is to provide for safety. How can we stand by when people are being killed, when people are being oppressed, when there are refugees because of ethnic cleansing, and say that it is actually not the government's duty to provide safety, it is to provide diplomacy? We see on side
proposition that all they have said in today's debate is pretty political talk. We will talk to other nations, and we will see what we can do. But what we see on the side, opposition is actually creating change, even if it means not solving every problem right away. We are setting the stage for long-term development and stability, and we argue that we are the only side looking out for the rights of the marginalized and the rights of sovereign nations. So at the end of the day, we argue that war is necessary, and war does actually create benefits in society. Thank you.
As my partner Arsalan said at the start of his speech, and as we've kind of heard in a contradiction inside opposition's case, like, we see that the only time opposition is justifying war is when an act of war has been started and we need to solve it. When someone has been getting beaten up, when someone has been getting, like, genocide has been happening, when an act of war from one entity is starting to kill at another entity, and that is when we can justify war to solve that problem. We'd say that, like, that in itself starting out is in fact an act of war. That in itself is unjustified. And we'd say that, like, that central assertion has been something that's made the opposition case fall. But even in that case, like, we're not right. We've still proven down the bench today that, like, on all counts, war does generate more problems than it solves. And in order to kind of show you guys this, I'm going to be breaking this debate down to the two main actors. One about the innocent actors, and then second about the entities at war. So what have we seen today? We've seen a side proposition come up and tell you that the innocent actors at war face a great deal of destruction. We see, like, civilians in these countries have, like, economic damage of having their infrastructure torn down. We've seen that, like, lives are lost on many, many counts. And we've seen that, like, furthermore, the environmental damage has been very substantial. Now, all opposition done is swallow these harms in the name of, like, the fact that we need to advocate for human rights around the world. We've seen side proposition show you the contradiction in that. I'm going to come to it later on. But, like, these are problems generated by war that they haven't responded to. Like, we see that this is a problem in a war-based society. Furthermore, the spillover into other nations. When we see a nation like Turkey get refugees from Syria, when we see a nation like Iran get flooded by Afghanistan, when we see, like, people having war torn into their countries because of another set of people fighting, those are innocent actors harmed that side opposition has not responded to. Innocent actors are harmed in the case of war, and we'd say that that makes it unjustified because it generates problems for them. We've clearly won on that grounds. But let's go to the only place where side opposition has been fighting this debate. Let's go to the entities at war. So, like, first of all, we've said that unjust war is bad, any case of it. Whether it's a proxy war that escalates into giving people more problems than necessary, like in the case of North and South Korea and and Vietnam internally. We'd say that, like, in those cases, the war was unjustified, and even genocides count as an act of war. In our definitions, we stated when when two groups are combating, and when one group is, aggressing against another group, that is in fact an act of war. Like, if that were a nation against another nation, that would be an act of war. Side opposition hasn't really come to terms with that. Those wars are unjustified. And then they jump to the case of defense. So, like, okay, they're defending themselves. War is justified in that case. We've shown you that, like, even in the event that we accept that model of, like, people have been feuding, they need to defend themselves, like, we're not going to count the original act of war as war. Problems are caused, problems are generated that are worse than the individual problem. We're actually perpetuating the circumstance. Rather than making it a 5-year dispute or a 4-year dispute or a short-term dispute, we make it elongated. We saw that, like, the problem started out in the First World War, spread into the Second World War. And then the way that the Second World War was solved was to then go off to the Cold War. And they said that that was all fine. We don't say, like, breaking Europe in half is fine. And then furthermore, breaking it up into, like, the different nations in the, like, West and East, feuding against each other is fine. We'd say that, like, war led to a state in developed countries, and especially in non-developed countries, where we see that problems are perpetuated because oppressing someone isn't solving the problem. Having bigger guns isn't solving the problem. OP never responded to this idea. What happens when oppressed groups decide to fight back, when oppressed groups decide to get malicious after being oppressed, we see that, like, terrorism has multiplied 4 times because after the war on terror, we didn't see a response to that. Because we've recognized inside government, that when you try and sugarcoat problems with bullets, all you get is more bullets, all you get is more conflict, all you get is more problems. Problems aren't being solved. And why this house is saying, this house believes that like war causes more problems than it solves, is very simple. You cannot justify a lack of diplomacy because it needed to happen, and then you cannot say that like conflict poses solutions, because all conflict does is oppress, all oppression does is breed, like, again, more problems. We've seen it's pretty clear today that government has won this debate. So thank you.